Andrei Soldatov is a Russian investigative journalist and security services expert. Together with fellow journalist Irina Borogan, he is co-founder of Agentura.ru, a watchdog of the Russian secret services activities. He's been covering security services and terrorism issues since 1999. Together with Irina, Andrei has also co-authored several books: The New Nobility, The Restoration of Russia's Security State 2010, The Red Web 2015, and The Compatriots 2019. And indeed, we did discuss that book in our last conversation if you want to go back and check that out. But it is their latest book that we'll be exploring in today's episodes. Our Dear Friends in Moscow, the inside story of a broken generation. Andrei is also a visiting fellow of King's College London and senior fellow at CEPA, the Centre for European Policy Analysis. Before we jump in, thank you to everyone who supports the channel through Patreon, Buy Me Coffee, and all the usual stuff. Your support, the generous comments you add to the videos are a tremendous help. They also help in the algorithm to make sure these videos are discovered by new people. Andrei, welcome back.
Thank you for having me.
Well, this is an extraordinary story, and of course, it feels like a very, very personal story. So let's jump in first to the motivations that you and Irina had for writing this, because you're stepping away from the more kind of analytical, academic style of looking at the Russian security state. And this is very much imbued with not just sort of personal insights, but I imagine some of it's quite sensitive to write as well.
Yes, it was really difficult to write, but the main reason why we wanted to write this book is that we had this conversation immediately after the full-scale invasion started in 2022. And by that time, as you know, we were already out of the country. We left in, well, 2 years before, and we lived in London. And of course, we had no illusions about the Kremlin and what these people were capable of, but still the level of support, say the best and brightest in Russian society, provided for this invasion, that came as a big shock. Also on a personal level, because we remember how it was like 10, 15 years ago, and to see the same people changing completely and providing this support, not only because of fear, but because of something else. That was quite astonishing. And we all understand that, of course, for Ukraine, this war started in 2014. But for Russian society, by and large, the big war started only in 2022. And you can't find an argument that maybe for some people it was still okay or possible to deny that there was a war after 2014, after the annexation of Crimea. So you could deny that actually Russian troops were there. You can try to find some excuse. But in 2022, it was absolutely impossible. And still people supported the war. So what we wanted to do, we wanted to find some explanations. We understood that you cannot blame everything on ignorance or stupidity or disinformation and brainwashing when you are talking about the Russian elites. And we thought maybe the best way to do that, because we are journalists and we cannot provide a sociological explanation, is to turn to people we knew really well, who sort of chose the dark side. And if we can understand what happened to them, maybe that could help to explain what actually happened to Russian society. Of course, it was really important for us to also to talk to these people, because you cannot write such a book based on, well, open source or your memoirs. You need to talk to these people. That is why, that was the second reason why we chose to talk to people who were once our close friends. And we believe that maybe if we approach them and, well, offer them this opportunity to explain themselves, maybe they would agree to that. And to our surprise, several of these people agreed, and that helped us to write this book.
And that, of course, is tricky, isn't it? Because in talking to Owen Matthews in a conversation we had even 2 years ago, he said it become quite difficult to actually get anybody, even the closest, or what he thought of as the closest of friends and colleagues, to not just open up about these sensitive topics, but talk about anything, that there's a certain level of sort of paranoia, understandable paranoia, that really sort of kicked off. I don't know whether it's, with the full scale war, probably is, because of course discrediting the army now carries a significant prison sentence.
Absolutely. And to be honest, we all need to remember that Matthew and us, we are in different positions because he is a British journalist. Of course, it's tricky already to talk to a British journalist, but we are Russian journalists who are seen by the Russian state as traitors. I'm on the wanted list of the Russian authorities, and also I'm a foreign agent according to the Russian law, which means that if you have any Russians talking to me, the Russian state might take it as a sign that they are talking not just to an enemy, but to a traitor. And as we all know from Russian history, it's much more serious. And that is why, yes, it was quite remarkable that these people decided to talk to us. And I think there might be two reasons for that. One is that at some point we were not just friends, but we were colleagues. And our profession, as you know, especially if you find yourself with these people in some really difficult sports, and you did things together, you covered really horrible things together, like wars or terrorist attacks, that creates some sort of bond which is really, really strong. You understand each other on some level which is probably unachievable for other people. The other thing is that because of our previous books, and maybe because of the attention our previous books got, maybe given how ambitious these people are, maybe they wanted to get a place in history. And all of these guys, and we are talking about 6 people, all of them studied history, and all of them are extremely ambitious. All of them wanted to do something really big, which would be remembered by Russians. And I think that is why they decided to talk to us to get this place.
Is there any sense in which now this is two ideas I'm going to throw into here before I ask you what your impressions are? One is, are they hedging their bets? Are they perhaps putting something down for the future so that if there's a dramatic change at some point, they can say, "Oh, well, look, I wasn't completely silent, and I've expressed this here, and it's on the record." The other alternative is slightly more worrying, which is, did some of these people seek consent to do these conversations from the very intelligent services that you've been studying, because it might have felt that it could be useful for some kind of, I don't know, campaign or other?
Yes, to be honest, that was one of my concerns when I, for instance, approached one guy. His name is Evgeny Krutikov, and he used to be my editor in the newspaper. We all met in 2000. That was a newspaper, Izvestia, which is a very old Soviet brand. I think it was launched by Bolsheviks around the time of the Russian Revolution.
Mm.
And the main thing about Izvestia that it was always very close to the Kremlin, always had access to the Kremlin. And that, by the way, was the reason why Irina and we decided to join Izvestia in 2000, because we were really young, ambitious journalists, and we just started writing about Russia's security and intelligence agencies. And to do that properly, you need to get access to these people. And we thought that maybe if we work for this newspaper, that would give us or help us to get access to these guys and the security services. But Krutikov was our editor, and he enjoyed quite close relations with the security services. And unfortunately, later on, he became even closer to them. He participated in disinformation campaigns run by the FSB, and we discussed that with him. But when I approached him, I had this concern that what if he would seek some approval from the military intelligence, because now he became really close to the military intelligence as well. all from the FSB. And as I said, I knew that he had participated in some disinformation campaigns for the FSB. What if? How I should react, what I should do, and it was tricky. For instance, of course, we all spoke via Zoom or video chats, and the difficulties is that he immediately requested a video, not just audio but video. So he wanted to see well, my surroundings. So I needed to think really carefully what could be seen and what he could understand about where I live, for instance. So I had these concerns. I also should be. I thought I should be more cautious about personal questions. But here you have a big problem. As a journalist, you know, to make an interview a success, you need to get emotional. That's how you provoke an emotional reaction from a person you talk to. There is no other ways. If you keep analytical, you cannot get people open for you, right? So I needed to become more emotional with him. That was tricky. That was difficult because we were from many things together. And of course, I saw a familiar face, a familiar voice, and it triggered so many things. And to be honest, maybe it was the most difficult thing I ever done as a journalist.
Before we move on to the next question, I'd like to make a personal recommendation that I know you will appreciate. You may have seen my interview last week with the producer of the film series Kiev of Mine, Ronnie Apteker. Well, I've partnered with them to help raise awareness of what I believe is an important series of films made for a Western audience to help break through absurd stereotypes about Ukraine, some of which, of course, are amplified by Russian propaganda. You can watch these films for free now. Details in a second. Kiev of Mine is a documentary series about Ukraine's extraordinary capital, which I had the privilege to visit for the first time in January this year. The film production began in 2018, and of course, much has changed since then. It's now 2025, and the story is far from over. Kiev of Mine is a fast paced, beautifully filmed, humorous, fun, insightful, heartbreaking, moving, and hopeful work. The very antithesis, in fact, of a doom laden and worthy wartime documentary. This is a work that is extraordinarily uplifting. My friend Operator Starsky says the film is made with so much love. The film series will make you laugh and cry. It's the only film about Ukraine that began before the war yet has traced lives through the tumultuous times and which follows the lives of more than a dozen Ukrainians in real time. This is an historic period told through highly personal and emotive stories from Kiev's days of emerging prosperity after the Maidan Revolution through COVID and the full-scale invasion. This film is a breath of fresh air. Ukraine deserves a better conversation in the world, one that isn't centered around war, says Jolyon Ellis, filmmaker on Kiev of Mine. It's hard not to argue with that, and the filmmakers have fully delivered on this promise. This is essential watching for anyone who calls themselves pro-Ukrainian, but I think it's also vital to get friends, colleagues, and family to watch it too, because the reality is few people have a vivid impression of Ukraine or any direct connection with its people. War is inhumane and abstract. Building an alternative perception is essential for engaging the world with the importance of Ukraine's struggle. On the other hand, you must also have in your head, aside from the analytical thing, you must have a certain level of judgment of the choices these people have made. There are very few who left in 2014, but there are some who turned against the regime in 2014 on very, very clear moral political grounds. There are some who left even around 2012. There are those who decided to leave in 22 and then 2023. Of course, 2023 is more, I don't want to fight in Putin's war rather than being morally opposed to it. But there are people who made those sort of judgments along the way. Those who remain, and I find characters like Venediktov quite interesting in that respect, in that you can no longer exist even as a sort of quasi-opposition without some accommodation with the regime. And if you have stayed and you're being paid by the state or by media organizations that depend on the state, then you must surely have made some kind of bargain with the devil. And so in your head, you must have this judgment of the people. You know that they have consciously made a bargain. They're not deluded into doing this. They're not buying the propaganda. They know what's going on. How did you get around that?
Well, of course, I had my personal perspective because for me and for Irina, actually, because we've been always working together, the history of our, say, full-stop job as Russian journalists unfortunately ended already in 2009. So what happened after that? We were employed by Novaya Gazeta in 2009, and they decided to fire us because the pressure from the FSB was too strong. But what happened next, and I remember that moment, I felt that that was the last big media which could employ us in the country. And just as it happens, I had some friends, American journalists, at that time told me, look, maybe you need to think about writing a book about the FSB. And I thought, well, I already lost my job as a journalist, as a staff writer for Novaya Gazeta. Nobody would publish our book. And that journalist, she told me, look, you can, no, I'm not talking about Russian publishers. Think about American publishers or British publishers. And we were fortunate to find an American publisher. So ever since 2009, we've existed in this really weird situation when we stayed in Russia. We wrote about what was going on in Russia, but for an American publisher. We also maintained and supported our website. But it's never been like a big media. Of course, it's now we have just two of us working on this website. So it was always a very specialized source of information about Russian security services. But of course, I understood that we are in this situation precisely for the reasons you described, because already by 2009, by 2010, it was clear that the pressure from the Kremlin, especially on journalists who were writing doing investigations, was getting really, really strong. And the editors got scared, the publishers got scared, the political situation changed. We already got several journalists killed. Remember that Anna Politkovskaya was killed in 2006. And before her, there was Yuri Shikachikhin who was poisoned. So it was already quite tricky. I think the difference between our protagonist and people like Venediktov is that Venediktov was always fighting this war by agreeing to a series of compromises. And of course, we all understand that the justification for people like he was always like, well, yes, I can do that, but if the survival of my media is at stake, maybe I should do something for the Kremlin. And at some point you ask, was it really worth it? That is this kind of game. But for our protagonist, these guys wanted to support the Kremlin very consciously. They worked in some liberal newspapers in the 1990s or in the beginning of the 2000s because they wanted to have access to the Kremlin, and back then there was still some liberalism in the circles, and also they wanted to be paid. But immediately, when we understood that the situation changed, and now it is a time to promote a patriotic and nationalistic agenda, they grabbed this opportunity. They wanted to do that. So they ideologically were very different from people like Venediktov, and much more, I would say, ideologically much more consistent. And that's what makes them interesting for me, because I remember the time when we believed, at least, that professionally speaking, we were on the same side. We understood the standards of profession in the same way. So how these things changed, how ideology changed them, why at some point they decided to give up journalism and our standards of profession to work directly or indirectly for the Kremlin. Because at some point, all of our protagonists ended up working for the state. Some cooperated with Russian intelligence agencies, some became high government officials. For instance, one of our protagonists is a minister of culture, Olga Lyubimova, and she is a minister of culture as we speak. The other guy who was a very good war correspondent, and we covered several really horrible things together. And he, Yevgeny Baranov, and he is now in charge of the Kremlin soft power operations based in Belgrade. So all of them made this transfer to the dark side, and that was what made them interesting for us.
So it's not just resources. I'm getting the impression that is the motivator here. It's not just, calling the tune that the piper wants you to, because that's where, where the money comes from. It seems that there is more of an ideological basis behind it. Do you get the impression these people are just sort of exercising their brain power and intelligence in a way that they see, really fits their skills, or are they definitely ideologically aligned with the idea of a resurgent Russia, with the idea of a revanchist imperialism, and let's face it, with the genocidal rhetoric, which has enabled this invasion of Ukraine? I mean, to sign up to one of those things, do they actually have to tick the boxes and sign up to the whole package?
Well, I think there were several big reasons for that, for all of them. And it's quite interesting that all of them share the same motivation, I would say. One is that all of them share some sort of nostalgia for the Soviet Union. And all of them, except one person, are quite older than us. So they came of age in the 1980s, when the Soviet Union was still a superpower. And all of these guys, they always felt quite nostalgic for this status that they used to live in a country which mattered a lot. The other thing is that all of them were extremely ambitious, and these ambitions they got from their families. Most of the protagonists come from really prominent Soviet families. Yevgeny Krutikov, for instance, has been always proud of being a descendant of a deputy prime minister under Stalin. He also has several very prominent spies and counterintelligence officers in his family, and he has been always proud of that fact. Olga Lyubimova, she came from a family of a very, very famous Russian actor, Kachalov, and there was a street named after him in the Moscow center. And there is a very famous poem written by Sergei Yesenin, who is a very famous Russian poet, and everybody knows this poem because it's a poem about the dog. And we all know this poem because we were taught this poem in our school. And this dog is Kachalov's. So immediately, if you say the name Kachalov, everybody knows who he was. So she had that status. Her family had that status. And they all wanted to achieve something politically and to have some impact. The interesting thing is that at the same time, all of them shared quite a dark vision about Russia. All of them at some point told me, or Irina, or made it public, that they believe that a country like Russia might be run only by a dictator. It's just how the things are. And if you want to achieve something in such a country run by a dictator, you either work for this dictator or you're out. And if you're out, you are a loser. And it's a very dark vision of how things should be done. They do not really believe in that Russia ever had a chance, democratic chance, and to be democracy. They believe it's gonna be always like that. And because it was okay for the like ancestors to achieve things and to promote and elevate the status of eight families under, say, Stalin, it's quite okay for them to do the same under Putin. It's a very consistent vision of what we can do. And it's, yes, it is very ideological, and it also, of course, includes right now a full support for what is going on in Ukraine.
It's interesting as well, because one of the questions I was going to ask was really the presence of the KGB FSB, because in the 90s, that period where, you started to rise up in the ranks, that was the first period where I think the intelligence services were historically weakened and were starting to be absent from certain parts of life, which they would have been prominent in or would have had fingers in those pies. But the generation you're talking about here, they would have sort of come of age. They would have really started to accelerate their careers and build on their abilities when the KGB was still prominent. And we know how that functioned. If you collaborate or make some kind of accommodation with them, then that can accelerate the career and build on the talent and ambition that you've got. If you refuse to collaborate, then that will blight and destroy the career, and irrespective of what talent you may have. Is it therefore the case that these people would have had to make accommodations at the tail end of the Soviet Union with those intelligence services, and actually those bargains, those relationships may have become resurgent relatively quickly through the 90s or in the early 2000s?
Absolutely. And I think the story of Yevgeny Krutikov is the most interesting here because, as I said, his granddad was deputy prime minister under Stalin, but his son, of course, was a very prominent Soviet official. He was promoted by his father, and he was a kind of advisor to Anastas Mikoyan. But at some point, when Stalin died, Krutikov's father was at the time already quite a successful Soviet intelligence officer based in Paris. He was arrested and sent to jail, and he spent several years in jail. So Krutikov, when he grew up, he knew the story of his father, but his father was in jail. And he developed a theory that his father was a victim of some thought force among Moscow elites immediately after Stalin's death. But nevertheless, he believed that this is how things should be in the country. At some point, when I mentioned to him the fate of his father, and I said, well, he was a victim of Stalin's poachers, he immediately said, no. That is absolutely untrue. My father or my family was never prosecuted by Stalin. It was after Stalin, and it was a result of some intrigues. It's not the result of some purges. And you see that for him personally, Stalin's reign was considered as something which promoted his family, not downgraded it. And that was important for him. And the period of 1980s and the 70s, he criticized to me not because it was totalitarian and because it was communist, but because it was weak in comparison with what he believed was under Stalin. And he himself tried to make a career, to start a career as an intelligence officer in the late 1980s. He played briefly with and he got some petition with Russian military intelligence, and he was already given a posting in Albania. But when the Soviet Union collapsed, and he understood that he had no career in Russian military intelligence because it was a collapse of the Soviet Union, so he moved to journalism. But he always believed that his proper place should be with the Russian military intelligence. And that was his ambition, his real ambition. And I think, and now, of course, he has been working closely with these guys for many years, but he has no problem with that. And also, he understands the stakes because his own father was a victim of this system, which was created on the basis that if you if you're not completely loyal, or if you have some problems and there are some new arrangements, you might end up in jail.
It's extraordinary, isn't it? And maybe this is a self-selecting system so that people who at any point in the last couple of decades have shown any independence of thought, despite this sort of roller coaster of wild freedom of the 90s and then suppression. In the longer view, these people are going to be ejected from the system and from the country. What you're going to be left with is people who are compliant and who are willing to work within the system itself. It is an extraordinary transition, though, isn't it, from the wild and chaotic 90s, which I think could be characterized by the absence of a strong central government and as you say, extremely weak intelligence services, to what we're seeing now, which is the development of a digital gulag. And in fact, in the last week, that has heightened significantly. It's now illegal to promote VPNs, and a whole bunch of other restrictions are starting to come in. I mean, to us, this seems like something which is impossible to rationalize. And how can people make an accommodation with that kind of freedom to this kind of totalitarian restriction? How do your interviewees accommodate themselves with this? Or is that wild freedom not seen as actually a benefit or a positive to them?
First of all, I should say that it's not only about the digital gulag. Now it's a real gulag we're building up. For instance, this summer, the FSB got the right to build up their own networks of prison facilities. The very first time in post-Soviet history, the FSB got this right, and they're also building not just prisons, but also logistics to move prisoners around the country. And that system would be absolutely separate from the Russian penal system, and which is quite a development, to be honest, in a very Stalinist way. Well, I think the way our protagonists see this is, well, it's quite complicated for them, because on one hand, all of them felt very angry because they believe that in the 1990s, they lost their social status. And that is why they were always very angry at, say, liberal media. And they're still angry at liberal media. And they believe that the liberal media were corrupt and pro-Western, and that is why they had it coming to them. And that is why all of them are quite okay with the restrictions of media freedom. But when I asked Krutikov, when he gave me this diatribe about liberal media, how they were all corrupt in the 1990s, so it was absolutely correct to censor them and attack them by Putin. And when I asked him, Evgeny, but don't you think that as a result of this attack carried out by Putin, all kinds of journalists, not only liberal journalists, but even pro-Kremlin journalists, all, as you can call them, patriotic journalists, all of them, all of us, lost something. We lost access to decision makers. We haven't anymore any access to the Kremlin. Nobody, even the closest journalist to Putin, they cannot talk to him, they cannot interview him properly. I mean, don't you think that a profession as a whole lost because of his attack? And he admitted that. He said, well, yeah, maybe. But because now we are in this big war with the West. So now the big justification for everything is this existential war with the West. And because they had this and share this dark vision that Russia has been always under attack from the West. And actually they developed this interesting idea that for at least 100 years, Russia has been fighting, Russian security services have been fighting this war with the Western intelligence agencies, and it had three stages basically. The first stage was immediately after the revolution, until the end of the Second World War. And that first stage was won by back then Soviet intelligence agencies when they scored all the big successes, including Cambridge 5, the nuclear bomb, attacks on Émigrés organizations. The second stage was obviously the Cold War, and they lost. And that loss cost them the country and the status for the KGB. So now they believe they are at this third stage and they had a chance to win. And they think that in this war, which is existential, well, yes, if it's about people getting killed or sent to prison, even if they have nothing to do with politics, so be it, because the stakes are so high. And for them, the stakes are really high. They believe that what is at stakes is the survival of Russia as a country.
That's an extraordinary internalization of Bolshevik paranoia and aggression, isn't it? And a denial of really quite extensive. I mean, you go back to travelers of the sort of 16th, 17th century, and the distrust and hatred of foreigners, the paranoia. You can see that it's there. There's a deep historical foundation for that. But this is a particularly sort of venomous kind of Bolshevik paranoia. But how far back do we have to go? Because you obviously talk about your own experience being relatively early on ejected from this system, even from the liberal media that had to make some kinds of accommodation to survive. Could we take it even further back to the early 90s and the takeover of NTV? Because at that point, in the reports that I read, it's fewer than 10% of the journalists made any kind of sort of moral professional choice that we can't exist under these conditions. And, 90% of all the talent at every single level decided, you know what, we're going to stay and we're going to work with fewer freedoms, editorial freedoms, but no, we're going to collaborate essentially with this regime. So how far back do you trace this sort of the corruption, as it were, of journalistic standards?
Well, probably we need to talk about the years immediately after Perestroika, because what Gorbachev did, it was absolutely extraordinary. He opened the country to criticism and he elevated the profession of journalism to such an extent that it was probably the most respected profession in the country. And if back then you were a journalist, well, it was not only about journalism. You were actually someone who defines the way people think about very important things, from the Russian past to the Russian future, what kind of country we're going to have. It was just absolutely extraordinary. I don't think that in any other country, journalists had this kind of position. Maybe we can compare it to what Russian famous writers had at the late 19th century, like Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, but these people never had any influence on political decision making. The Tsar would never listen to them. With Gorbachev, it was different. But what happened immediately after that, and that was already happening during Perestroika years, is that the KGB was always there. And the problem is that these guys were thinking quite strategically. For instance, they started working with journalists. Because almost immediately after, say, 1987, 1988, because they were fearful that at some point they could have, something what Stasi had got, a complete dissolution and maybe trial. I think what was really important for the KGB, that, of course, they had some formidable resources. For instance, they had these units which was in charge of running disinformation campaigns and also of prosecuting political dissidents. And they launched press offices at the KGB at every level, from Moscow to regions. And at every level, these new press offices were stuffed with officers with the previous experience of working with political dissidents. And nobody paid attention to that. That is quite extraordinary. If you look at the officers who ran the KGB press office in the 1990s, all of these guys at some point had some time serving with the infamous fifth directorate of the KGB. And that created, of course, a network of dependencies between journalists, because some of them were recruited, some of them didn't know how to write about these topics independently. There was no tradition, real tradition, to write about such sensitive things. And many media just accepted that, this new system, which, yeah, well, you can write about these guys, but you need to have some people, and yeah, maybe it's not very independent, but it's okay. I remember myself when I thought what I wanted to write about this topic, and that was probably 1998, 1999. I immediately realized that I didn't have a proper example for me to follow how to do that properly. So what I did, I just started buying lots of books written by American and British journalists who wrote books about their security and intelligence agencies. And that helped me, to be honest, a lot, because I couldn't find a proper example in my country. We had, as I said, a long tradition of books written about the KGB, but these books were sponsored by the KGB.
Yes, they're not exactly impartial.
Not exactly what you want to follow as an independent journalist. The other thing was that many prominent journalists who started writing about the KGB, they're from the families of the KGB. They had some family connections. And again, you don't want to do that this way. And I completely understand that, of course, and for instance, in this country, in the United Kingdom, sometimes the connections between journalists and British intelligence agencies are also quite close. The problem is that you don't have this element of fear, because we all had it in our blood, the feeling and the sentiment and the memory of what it was like under Stalin. So that the intelligence agencies are not only about intelligence, it's also about repression and terror. And it's been always like that. So unfortunately, I think that maybe we had a chance, but it was a really slim one. And of course, and what we missed a proper big public investigation over the KGB. And I've had this conversation with many Russian human rights activists, including from Memorial. And the ideas they had at the time were absolutely crazy. For instance, at some point, they believed that they could use the KGB as an ally against the Communist Party. They really believed that the Communist Party was a big threat, that the KGB was just an instrument. So if they could make this instrument apolitical, they really believed in that, they could use the KGB against their biggest enemy, which was absolutely, as you understand, absolutely crazy.
And this is the accommodation, of course, which Yeltsin managed to make with the help of some Western political spin doctors who helped build the campaigning. Yeah, this was the sort of this, I guess, is where it went horribly wrong, which is deciding that you can collaborate with such a thing, and then Berezovsky got sucked into that, thinking that he'd be able to control Putin if he was to put him on the throne. But what you also describe here is latent fear, and a fear passed down through family, through recollections, as well as personal experience, a fear of the intelligence services. So when this authoritarian state started to really get its claws back into society, it seemed to already have like a priming, an emotional, intellectual priming, that it could use to manipulate people's behavior. I mean, do you have a strong sense of that? And Ukraine, despite having been, the focus of things like the Holodomor and terrible, persecution from those same security services, they seem to be able to have shifted out from that mindset and moved away from fear, which is so restrictive of political action.
Absolutely. And also, you need to add brutality. Brutality is extremely important. And we are not talking only about precaution or poisonings, which are extremely important, but brutality being an essential element of the system. We have in our book a story of one protagonist. Her name is Svetlana Babayeva. And she was a journalist of the so-called Putin's presidential pool, which means that she was part of the group, a very small elite group of journalists who accompany Putin in all his travels. And of course, because of that, she got really close access to Putin. At some point, she got so close, and that was already in the early 2000s, that she believed and she was really proud of being asked by Putin for some advice, for instance, for a choice of ties. And she boasted about that in our editorial office. And of course, she got a good protection. For instance, she got a protection from Sergei Ivanov, who was at the time was a close friend of Putin and a minister of defense, and at some point the head of the administration of the president. So she enjoyed all kinds of access, all kinds of perks which come with that. She got two really good stints. So at some point, she served as a head of the RIA Novosti bureau in Washington, D.C. She served in London. And again, she was really happy with that. But at some point after 2014, maybe because her backer Ivanov lost his position, or maybe because she was not extremely enthusiastic about Crimea, she lost her access to the Kremlin. And what happened to her, I think, reflects the brutality of the system. She lost her access. She was offered just one position. She was offered a position in Simferopol, in the occupied Crimea. She went there to run this very small office in a provincial town of Simferopol, basically to be in charge of brainwashing the Russians in Crimea, which was considered to be a very big loss in comparison with Moscow, Washington, and London. And she got so desperate because she lost access to her beloved Putin that she started looking for adrenaline everywhere and elsewhere. So she started with riding horses, then with climbing mountains. Then she moved to training with special forces. And when the big war started in 2022, she started training like crazy because she wanted to go to Ukraine to fight, not to be an embedded journalist on the side of the Kremlin, but to go to Ukraine to fight, to kill people as a soldier. And at the very last day before her trip to Ukraine, to the occupied territories, she was at the shooting range with Russian soldiers, and she got killed by friendly fire. Think about it. A 50-year-old woman, a very sophisticated woman, a journalist who had enjoyed access to the Kremlin for almost 30 years, with career stints in Moscow, Washington, and London, ended up dead from a bullet of a special forces soldier at a shooting range. That's how brutal it is. Because she understood she could get back her access to the Kremlin if she would prove herself loyal enough to serve as a soldier, and she got killed. That's how it works.
It sounds like an extraordinary addiction to power or status, which you've mentioned many times. One thing we haven't heard mentioned in any of these accounts, and is pretty much absent from most of the book, is any sense of a moral framework or a moral architecture, or any reflection upon the nature of killing, genocide, values of any sort. Yes, we have this perception of a war on the West, the sort of third stage of a war on the West. Everything is defined in terms of power, status, and conflict, and a very, I would say, extractive kind of mindset. What we don't have here is anything one could vaguely construe as values. How do you explain that?
Well, for that, we have a really good example with Olga Lyubimova. Before she was appointed by Putin as a Minister of Culture, She was a prominent journalist, writing mostly about and making documentaries. She was not a writer. She made documentaries about the Russian Orthodox Church, but she was quite liberal. She enjoyed life in Moscow. And she was also very active, writing for her blog. Back then, it was Live Journal. And that provides us with a really good example of what these people think of and how they think. At the time of the Moscow protest in 2011, 2012, when all Moscow intelligentsia went to the streets to protest against Putin, she posted what she called a manifesto of Lyubimova. And in this, she wrote that I had so many friends now freezing their guards on Moscow streets, protesting against Putin. And I don't understand them because I understand it's all absolutely useless. I live in this country, and that's her words. I cite here. I live in this country under presumption that, well, I should behave like a woman which is raped. I just need to spread my leg and try to enjoy it. Think about it, how dark it is.
It is. It's extraordinary, and the retention of power, status, material, resource, all these kind of things come into play. And of course, the hierarchy of power is built in that fashion to exactly deny resources to those who are not loyal, etc. But the last area here, and this comes, but this is sort of personal as well as analytical, is any community, is any Russian-speaking community from who's had any involvement in the sort of state architecture of Russia, is anybody free from the distrust, manipulation, coercion, and surveillance? Because it seems that this attitude, this system of understanding the world, does not allow free peoples on the territory of Russia, nor does it really tolerate the emergence of free voices or collectives of free voices and free peoples who call themselves Russian outside the country either.
Well, I think it's not that dark because for 30 years, several generations of Russians were exposed to liberal ideas, to the West, to how things are outside of the country. And at some point, it was quite visible in Moscow that Moscow became a very westernized city. The way people talk, the way the rules changed, like of social behavior, that was strikingly different from what we had in the 1980s, for instance. Of course, and we got lots of foreigners, well, even teaching in our universities in Moscow, St. Petersburg, and some other cities. And these people who were taught this way, were exposed to this culture, they're still there. Some of them left, of course, but lots of people are there. And sometimes we forget about it, that there are still people who are in the country and they resist. The problem is that right now you cannot oppose the regime openly. It's just absolutely impossible. You immediately go to jail, but you can do several things. And we know of networks of Russian activists who are trying to help, and they helped a lot to, for instance, Ukrainians trying to leave the country through the western border, because sometimes it's impossible to leave directly to Ukraine. So you have these networks, you have other people, you have lawyers. I don't want to mention even categories of these people because it's risky for these people, but they are there, and that's the reason why we, as journalists who are based outside of the country, we still are well able to work, because we rely on these people, on the information provided by these people. So there are still people there who are great and brave, and they want to change the country. It's not that dark and horrible.
Yeah. But of course, the state is intent on trying to disrupt and inject distrust into these networks. But it is heartening to hear that there may be some foundations, at least, for change. Hopefully, when it comes. I think we're out of time on this one. Of course, I had a million more questions to ask because it is a deeply fascinating book. I highly recommend people read it. I'm sure from this conversation, many will be curious to read the stories within it. Andrei, thank you so much for coming on. And of course, thank you to Irina as well for the incredible work that you both do.
Thank you for inviting me. Thank you.
A final word from our partners, the makers of Kiev of Mine. All three films are now available to watch for free on YouTube. Please check out the links to the dedicated website, which tells you more about the film, its subjects, and the filmmakers. Also, in the description is a link to the YouTube channel where you can watch the films now. Do let us know in the comments what you think of them and if they inspire you as much as they have inspired me.